the clinical data mapping. And I was going to give a little presentation, but I decided against that because I would much rather leverage the expertise in the room and have a discussion around this. So really, this is just all the terminologies. Okay. So what we had to do in order to collect the clinical data for our maternal, to support our maternal needs case, was we went to get all of the forms and everything that are the data that is currently written down and collected on pregnant women right now. And so there's a number of sources, and I'll kind of go through those as well. But the real challenge, the first activity was really to harmonize across forms, and I'll show you that. And then we had to then map from those forms and the harmonized data to something that we could use as a standard. So here's the challenge. This is in Cure 1. This is the antenatal form that's collected on all women. This actually asks about are there any risk factors. This is specifically asking about edema. That's what it looks like on the antenatal form in Cure 1. On the register, that same piece of data is collected, but it's asked differently. Instead of asking, do you have this, yes or no, they say, do you have any of the following risk factors? And a number of risk factors are listed, so edema being one of them. Then, so there's already two sources, and to the untrained or naive-eyed, as I might have been at the beginning, those seem quite similar, and you should be able to map them. But there is a fundamental difference in asking whether or not you have something, yes, no, or not asked, or do you have any of the following complications with a long list of them. So in addition to, this is an artifact of the fact that this is in the paper world. There wasn't enough room on the register to ask every question. So they turned it around and did it this way, thinking it meant the same thing. And that's fine when you are all using the same register. Semantic interoperability that everybody understands what everybody else is doing is a little bit clearer. When we start to store things that we then want to pull back and look at years later, we have a whole different set of problems.
Can I ask a question? Who owns these forms?
The Ministry of Health.
Okay.
One good thing about Rwanda,
And they're consistent across all the districts?
yeah, I was going to say, one good thing about Rwanda is that these are national forms. The same ones are filled out on every single pregnant woman, on every, the maternity registers the exact same, and the antenatal register is the exact same. So here comes the problem. So fine, we do this large mapping exercise, and I'm going to show you that big, messy spreadsheet in a minute. So I take all of the different forms of data that are collected on pregnant women right now and say, are these things the same thing? So this sort of harmonization effort. Then when you go to map this, remember the thing is, the question is, does the woman have edema? Just in the concept dictionary in Rwanda alone, I came up with at least 4 things that could possibly match this. But none of them are exactly the same question that we wanted. And actually, there's far more than this. They're looking specifically at edema of the feet, or you could do an examination of the limbs and find edema as one of several findings. So there's no question that's exactly perfectly matching what we need. And you can also tell that some of the difficulties are people making a new concept when they were not completely certain of what to search for, what the proper synonyms were. And so we wind up with edema, swelling, things like that, which is expected. And I know that there's been a big effort to clean up the dictionary. And it's really not that bad. It's just that this is one of the challenges to it.
460 and 6001 are separate concepts.
Yeah, I know. They all
One's
have.
an increase of anything.
Yeah.
Edema is a particular part of the body.
Yeah. And so they sometimes the swelling was used to mean edema and vice versa. So there becomes that's the semantic interoperability. So what do we mean when we say swelling versus edema? And when do we use one versus the other? And this is even talking about the international classifications to map it to that. So here's some of the problems. So the maternal concept lab has FEMA listed slightly differently, and I did map into the internal concept mapper. So we have all these sort of inconsistencies across the different concepts, and then what do they really mean as far as what can you map to an ICD code, what can you map to SNOMED, when it gets complicated very quickly. So we need to come up with a way on how to decide. Now, it occurred to me how completely ridiculous it is for me to sit in my house in Canada and do this. Because this belongs to Rwanda. Yes, we can do it to move the project along, but this was such an enormous learning opportunity that sort of came on one of our project calls, came to the group consensus that we should leverage the opportunity to involve the developers and others here in Rwanda to figure this out as we go along, rather than me, calling Paul or Sean, and maybe Andrew and a bunch of other experts to determine the different options and how we might do it and discuss on the call, that when you actually come across each one of these issues, it's a lot easier to sort of talk through and solve. So Rwanda, there's a lot of times there's no perfectly right or wrong answer to things. There's several ways to do it, and we need to decide on some kind of rules and guidelines, and Rwanda needs to apply them consistently. And so that's a little bit where we're at now. And we can go ahead and map the rest, and if we have to make the project work, that's fine, but that's not a very long-term solution. We also need to consider, and the person in Rwanda who's going to take on this role really has to have a very solid understanding of what their reporting needs are, so that they can say that it's this element, or this concept. When you call for that in a report, you're going to get what you actually need to be getting, to some way the question you're trying to ask, that sort of thing. So here's some examples of some of the problems. And I know where we had this discussion, I did a presentation for Javert's developers last week, I think, as well, where we talked about some of this stuff. So we have the concept of a CD4 count, and so there's two different ways to do it. One is that you can have the following attributes: the date and time it's drawn, the results, the units, etc. Or, which is what happens right now, do we have a CD4 count as a concept and the date of the CD4 count as another concept? It kind of depends. So one of the initial discussions was a CD4 count comes along with the date and time of that observation. But there's multiple dates and times. So sometimes if a patient sitting beside you, you can say, when was your last CD4 count? And they can say, yesterday. That should not be attached to today's encounter for last week, because it matters physiologically when that was actually drawn. So it matters physiologically when that was drawn, not when it was ordered or things like that, right? So it's not relevant to today, it's relevant to the time it was drawn. But my encounter was timestamped for today. So there's some issues like that, so especially with some tests that we often will ask people when they had when was your last CD4 count, when was the last time they made an HIV test, versus a test that might be ordered on one day, drawn or cultured the next week or the next day, and reported a week later. And so we care a lot about the specific dates. So having two concepts, I mean, I've had long conversations with me about this. He favors the first one versus the second one. So these are the kinds of examples of things that we have to decide, not necessarily as this large group, but ideally as the clinical terminologies are that Rwanda is going to suggest that we work with on this. And so that's sort of where we are with the problems. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second to see if anybody has any questions. And what I was going to do is go on and show you the data and the actual mapping exercise.
I could just say, from my side, when I encountered this problem before, because I also had that on several occasions, for me the fundamental question was always, are we modeling the form or the reality? And to some extent, we constrain the problem by saying we're modeling the form. So in other words, what we put into the concept dictionary is essentially what is constrained by what is on the form, and then try and least restrict it that way. Because if you get into trying to think of the reality, it becomes really tricky. And you start to think about, what are you trying to achieve with this information source? Is it really a way to capture what's on the forms and to put that into a database which can be used? And I think once you get to a situation where we're using EMRs in at point of care, it may be different.
Yeah,
We can model these kind of things either way. If we decide to take something like a CD4 and split it into multiple pieces. So this piece is the CD4 value, this piece is the CD4 date, this piece is the CD4 unit of measure. We can totally do that, and we can tell ourselves we're modeling form. But we have to recognize that if we do that, we're creating an extra layer of complexity for our application and for the transfer, because those three things which we're modeling as separate observations really aren't, and therefore they have to be linked in transport and storage. Think of the case where you have two CD4 values, two CD4 dates, two CD4 units of measure. I have to say this value and this date and this unit of measure link. So we have to create a secondary linkage, and yeah, we can do it. We're just making our life harder.
Do not.
So I'm against that.
Do not post-coordinate.
This question comes up a lot, and ideally, in the perfect world where there are no costs or anything, and you can connect infinite amounts of data, let's collect this and store it in as granular process possible. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where the cost of gathering data, the cost of storing data is finite. So what are the prioritized questions to ask? If the Ministry of Health lives and dies on whether or not it can tell when the last CD4 count was, then you focus lots of resources and you design a technical system to do this. However, I don't think that's the case. And I think that the dates of observations are common, pieces that they don't necessarily, they're part of metadata, they're not part of the first class observation. So I just, this is a question of what's important to gather and model this first class where we will, answer the question. So I just suggest that there's no right or wrong answer, there's just what's the best answer for the system to go to. And Paul, this particular element, goes forward.
You already have a massive granularity issue as it is. Just don't.
Oh, yeah, I understand that. There are just exactly what Shaw just said. There's not a right and a wrong answer. There are implications to either one. We need to make decisions and we need to handle it.
So does anybody disagree with Paul? I guess.
There are right and wrong pragmatic decisions that in this first round. And to decouple what an observation is into its components is way overkill, and we get no value from that whatsoever.
But there are different ways, or even whether you ask the question as a question with a series of responses, and that's just one example. There's many, many other things that we can look at. Or what happens if inside of one of those observations, value or something changes that is an attribute of that observation. How do you handle that later on? For example, something was measured in millimoles, it's now measured in micromoles. The number doesn't match. You have to create a concept for that and then deprecate it first. So there are lots of issues around that. And as I was going through this exercise, a lot of them would come up and we realized that this is something that is good to have a dialogue around, to make up guidelines around so that at least it's being handled in a consistent way. Between all of the data outlets to try to fix it rather than just go ahead and patch it together. We could patch it together, but that's not a good long-term strategy. Let me just go through some of this and then we can come back and look at some of the bigger questions. So here's the kind of thing that I did. So each of these blue things, one on the top are one of the different sources of data. So there's the maternity register, the ANC register, the ANC form, rapid SMS photo that was sent with the description, and then I also mapped it to the internal concept lab. So these are the ones that we had to account for inside of Rwanda, the data that was currently collected. We took into account anything that was already being used as an indicator to ensure that it was consistently represented. And I also went to the clinicians. Sometimes it would say on the form, breasts, which you can give a check mark to, but that you have them. What do you mean by that? Is this a sort of exception-based charting? Like, what do you mean to gather that sort of metadata around it so that you would actually have that?
So there's a disambiguation of what's on the form.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So, and even between forms, there,
And I think there's a related question as to when you disambiguate something on a form, do you do it by going to the source of the person who made it, or do you do it by going to the clinicians who tell you how they're actually interpreting it?
we did both.
Okay. And then how do you reconcile when they're not the same?
We asked Rachel.
Okay.
There were a couple of things that were similar, more or less.
Well, he's certainly authoritative, no question, right?
Is the documented process of that?
Yeah, no, actually, in conjunction with this, trying to put together this higher power kind of advisory group to come and answer some of these broader questions.
Yes. Richard, do you understand fundamentally that when there's a disconnect between how the clinician's interpreting the form and what the author intended it to be, then that form needs to be changed, right? And so, I mean, I think independent of the RAIA project, all we're doing is help bring to stark contrast inherent ambiguities, right? Which are fundamentally a problem as you're thinking about the development of systems, right?
So, I mean, I think a great example is that what you showed, go back to your swelling and edema, right? So can you pull up that? Yeah.
I just want to point this out, right?
Right, so zoom that up. So if you look, the description of those is completely unambiguous, right? One is the increase in size or volume as a result of internal pressure, which you would say. That is very general, right? You look at edema on the other hand, and it says an abnormal excess accumulation of serous fluid in gut tissue and serous cavity, which is very clearly a physiologic process. Swelling is not necessarily anything to do with physiology. But if the person is interpreting at the clinic is interpreting swelling to be edema, then that definition is not actually correct. Swelling needs to be, in that case, a synonym of edema, not a separate concept that describes an increase in size or volume.
Exactly.
Right.
And I believe that swelling here was actually an error.
So it needs to be a synonym.
Right. But, and I think that's because they were looking for edema, maybe couldn't find it, because it had an O in front of it, and created swelling, figuring out the same thing. And then one huge challenge you have with the HG up here is that form I showed you in Rwanda, that the clinical level of many of the people delivering HG up there is relatively low. They're lower level nurses, and it is written in plain language. And so interpreting that becomes a little bit more difficult when you get a map it against something that's a little bit more clinically focused.
The point is that there are colloquialisms to a given environment where they might take a concept like swelling and have a very intended meaning, but the concept itself has a broader a broader definition. And in cases like that where you can't come up with any resolution, then the solution is to not use that word at all, or to link it in a couple of different places. You can link it as its own concept and have it as a synonym as well. So when someone's picking, they have to choose from amongst them, right? But I think the point, though, is that when you're doing semantic interoperability, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? It's clinical people having a very specific belief about what they're documenting and making sure that's as unambiguous as possible as it relates to how the system is designed. And I don't think that the two of us are the right people to be sorting that. That's a Rwanda thing to sort, and that needs to be someone who wakes up every day thinking about and concerned about the inherent ambiguities and how people communicate in the country as it relates. And they need to be the ones that are modifying, evolving these forms and working long term. Does this make sense? Yeah. And all we're doing is identifying what the issues are around it, and we can make it work for this use case. But I think the fact that we're trying to identify ambiguities and then go to you as a tiebreaker is dangerous, to be candid with you.
Yeah, and truthfully, I said that slightly flippantly. There were not very many things I shouldn't point out specifically, but Richard and I have talked a lot about a bigger process to put in place to have consultation and water acceptance for that.
Yeah.
Does that also include the feedback to the training of the people who fill this out, so you can integrate it with reliability and what kind of data quality?
Yeah, it doesn't rate at this minute, but it will. And when we have the forms, we'll be able to do the same thing. Chris?
Yeah, I thought I heard another problem that I've encountered keeping info, which was the same concept, but with different data types being stored for it. The rests yes, no versus rests with a different type of, we often encounter that on forms. Have you got much of that? In other words, it's the same concept, but it's got a different...
You could deal with that on the receipt side.
Yeah, that's what I was showing you, and there were some like that. And some of the mappings were just, here's what they are. And this is typically where my issue came, was between the maternity, or the ANC register and the ANC form. And it was predominantly because the ANC form used more plain language with mapping, so they didn't use the exact same words. But a clinician, any clinician would know that they need the same thing, number of pregnancies, fertility, and so on, right? So some of those were completely clear. Here's one that gave me a huge amount of trouble, which is one form asked the number of cesarean sections, and another form asked, did she ever have a previous cesarean section? Obviously, to the outsider, those are different things. But for clinical purposes, all that should be mostly just count care is at 0 or more, because if they've had a previous cesarean section, they're at different rates. Doesn't matter if she's had 5, really, or 1.
That's why I may be wrong here, but it seems to me that's why I said, are you modeling the reality of the form? Because there's a subtle difference there in terms of what you store back. And if you're modeling the form, which I kind of think is what Sean was saying, if you're modeling the form, you're targeting exactly what the needs of the ministry, which is to computerize the form, to generate reports, etc. Because if you change the subtle concept behind it, when you store that from what's actually on the form, you potentially won't be able to generate those reports. So I think like what Sean was saying, you need to constrain the problem and decide what is your end game. What are you trying to get out of this, and therefore how do you decide what to do in a case like that, where is it a different concept, is it...
I think we have a problem. If our job is to collect data off the forms and generate reports from those forms, then it's easy to say automate the form. But if our problem is to collect information and use it to do things, and I think that's what we said we want to do with the shared health record, we're not at liberty to sort in our database simply answers to prompts on forms, but we have to store in our database stuff that's meaningful in terms of healthcare. And that's where we get this contradiction. So some of the things that Liz ran into, such as, do I capture a list of possible conditions, or do I simply list each condition yes, no? Those, I think, are matters that you can go either way on. But pragmatically, something like the date of the test and the result value, we have to link those in order to be able to use the data. Yeah. If we have to link them, it's pragmatically easier. We can do it either way, but it's easier to link them if we capture them as aspects of a single concept.
And I think it's just the same with regards to actually implementing the system. They're going to need to know, do they just implement what's on the forms, or do they go through the separate process where we actually model the data?
Well, there was one problem we had was that the forms weren't consistent in the first place. And so even if you were going to say we're just coming with the form, the question would become what form? And then so I think what we tried to do is solve it by saying, well, really what do you mean clinically by that? And is there a consistency there? So we tried to maybe you can do a bit of a hybrid, is through this forms, but actually model based on what was actually intended.
And it's obvious that there are issues with these forms, and first of all, they are created at different times by different people, so these issues are bound to happen. So, if anything, the clinical advisory group should have been there before to create these forms, but it wasn't there. So, yeah, in this situation, we have different forms. What I would advise us to do is to point out, like you did, these those gray areas where I think there is not good clarity, and then we bring it to the attention of the yet to be formed clinical advisory group, which I actually requested for that group to be formed, and it's going to be formed for sure. But short of that, we can use our clinical knowledge. Fortunate enough, I mean, I personally have some clinical background. So, for example, deciding between how many cesareans have you had as opposed to have you ever had a cesarean, the simplest choose have you ever had a cesarean, because whether they are one or two, we try to assess the risk of whether and the history of cesarean, kind of an indication to another cesarean, or that's a pregnancy. So, and if I make such a decision, I know it's not going to be fatal. I know that. If we fail to report at the end of the month, I would rather face that problem then and say, okay, we can't generate the report on how many cesareans do you have, because we implemented it this way in marriage. So we are encountering problems at different stages, and sometimes you may solve a problem and create another along the way that you're ready to defend and get through. So I'm saying that we can't, if we don't have the clinical advisory group to advise in such a thing, which is, do we choose number of cesareans or history of cesarean, we can buy the plate and take the decision. I mean, I'm not saying that please go ahead and take all the decisions, but because I just with myself and I am we can make such a decision. It's not the ideal situation, but we have to move forward.
But the trump card is clinical care delivery, not reporting.
Sure, yeah. Of course, yeah. I mean, meat projects don't care. There are two distinctions. Are you implementing for reporting purposes for the ministry or program level, or are you implementing to take care of a patient? So obviously, the priority is patient care, because the reporting should be to improve patient care anyway. So first of all, you target the clinical value of what you're implementing, and not the fact that you just, because after all, I'm sure if you report, if you get a monthly report of this is the number of women who had five history cesareans, it won't be helpful for any public health decision or any implement. So I would find
That's useful guidance for us, though, that that's the trump card.
definitely, of course, category is
Not
So-
working back.
no way.
So I guess I made kind of a point, and then the meta point that I thought I heard made previously, but I'll make again. So these sorts of discrepancies, as we're hearing, come up all the time. And this is the normal course of action. Neither is right. And we're having this conversation right now. What is right? Neither is right. Both are right. If you want to collect both, or just one of them is right. The process of making that ascertainment is what the vocabulary specialists spend a lot of the time doing. And I would advocate, while you are absolutely highly qualified to make these decisions, your time should probably spent otherwise. I can tell you that although Paul and I do have a great deal of experiences, we don't spend our days reconciling these issues. We have vocabulary specialists who work, and I think this process is highly illustrative of the sorts of capacity that Rwanda is going to need. And the meta process of saying, oh, we have discrepancies. How do I resolve these discrepancies? What is the process? That's really important.
And a long-term definitely need people who will be in this kind of work, about just a short term from us to meet urgent needs. But I do get that really Paul also emphasize that you need, people who are doing a restriction on that and making sure that those kind of issues are addressed all the time.
And we understand that this is going to be difficult to get up and going all at the same time, but we just want to reiterate to you that you don't go to class to learn how to do this. There's no class that you can take that will teach you this. You learn through experience. We're doing it right now. We're all here. You have a lot of experts in the country that can help with this. I understand that you only can do what you can, but what we're saying is the opportunity is now to train. And so you have to decide how you best want to take advantage of that. That's it. Okay?
And that's we sort of talked around as a short-term way forward solution until that real clinical terminology person can be on board and found. But in all likelihood, we're probably going to have to grow those skills because you're probably not going to find somebody ready-made in country. So, which is fine. But as we go through these, to have sort of a little consultation group, maybe a weekly call or something, we wouldn't have to do it for a very long time, just as we finish mapping. To have these discussions, and exactly like the decision you said, it comes down to clinical care, is there significance, this is the process we went through, to document that, and from that kind of produce guidelines. The next time you come across a similar project, see if this guideline applies. If it does, go ahead and use it. If it doesn't, or have it, I guess. If it doesn't, then, we probably have to have that discussion again. So, I don't know if that seems like a reasonable way forward. I don't know how else to address this. And still leave enough behind for people to...
I think we said to him what we would say. I think we have to move forward with the project. And, it's up to you, to decide. Do you want to be the receiver of that knowledge?
No.
Is there someone else that you want to receive that knowledge? And the answer is we don't have anyone right at this point. And we say we did the best we could. And we still have to move forward with the project, right?
I think at this point, I think close the discussion. What I have something that is actually involved. There's a small level of complexity because most of these forms, we have some of them in Kinyarwanda, some of them in French, some of them what we concept language in English. So we got an issue about translation because actually some stuff get lost in translation or get gained in translation. So we get distortions that actually come through translation. So it is also another complexity that we need to mention because when we compare the different forms, most likely it will depend on languages that have been initially written in the context.
We did have the Tier 1 form translated by a certified medical translator person. So looking specifically to make sure that we understood it correctly. I think you're absolutely right, we have to take that into account. But I also think one of the other big conflicting problems is the fact that in Tier 1 and also for anything that's dropped SMS related, they use very lay language, layperson language, which makes it a little bit fuzzier sometimes when you're trying to map. I think, how long am I supposed to be talking about?
13 minutes.
13 more minutes, okay. So I wanted to talk about, sort of get input onto my other big problem that I have strong feelings about. And so this meeting that they're not the same. and so anyway, but Nita and I often have to discuss the modeling piece of this. So here's the problem. And so on the ANC register, it lists anemia as a potential complication. So you know how I showed you that it has a little tiny thing, you put a coded A for anemia, E for anemia, and so on. So it says any antenatal issues or complications, and anemia is a choice. I mapped that, right or wrong, this concept similar, to on the ANC form, it actually says, is their hemoglobin less than 110? Rapid SMS, remember those are lay people making you think, has a code for severe anemia. And I can't remember, I looked up when they're supposed to use this, what the training that they were given, so I understand how are they diagnosing severe anemia, and it was quite vague. can't recall exactly what it is, but it was Nordic, Ireland, or so the difficulty becomes, are these the same thing? Would this map to a single concept of anemia? Or would these each be something different? And there's a related problem I can discuss as well later. Maybe I won't spoil it by telling what I think.
Well, I don't know that I have enough information to answer your question. You're asking two entities are the same, and you're saying one of the entities I can't really define. So I don't know how to tell you whether or not they're the same.
So all this they're given is anemia, which on the register, there's no specific guideline or document that accompanies the register that says when they call that anemia versus when they don't. On the ANC form, is actually funny thing with this. It does say hemoglobin less than 110. That's perfectly clear. I say that's a different concept. But and RAP SMS code is SA, and it was lay language around the fact that they think you're pale and tired. And so whether or not these are all anemia that was for.
One is the diagnosis, the interpretation, I think it's an observation, it's a, as a concept, it's a different thing. How you want to treat it, you might want to, conflate those. But, heuristically,
you're exaggerating my feelings on this question. On the other one, I have a strong feeling. On this one, I have an opinion. I agree with Chris that the statement that the hemoglobin result was below some level, that's a result, and it's very different from saying anemia. Basically, the question I think we had is if a trained clinical person says anemia and a untrained community health worker says anemia, do you capture those as separate concepts, or do you capture them as the same concept but record what kind of person made the assessment? My preference is for the second, but that is a judgment call. It's not a matter of live or die as to the question of dates and units of measure is.
And actually, just for your interest, to make this even further complicated, on the ANC form, they asked the question, is the hemoglobin less than 110? I said, what's your process for doing the labs and where do you write the result? Because if it's 90 is different than if it's 109 and so on. And they said, actually, we don't do the hemoglobin. This to them just means are they even? So they answer hemoglobin less than 110 as yes, if they physically find the person to be anemic. So that's just an additional wrinkle. But so either way, when we're trying to say how do we capture this, and I completely agree with Chris. To me, they were all different concepts, findings, diagnosis, etc. But the way that they're being used right now, they're used to mean the same thing.
Yeah, I think we should solve problems that we can't solve, and leave those that have been there anyway that we can't solve. Leave them to and address them to the people who actually concerned. Say, for example, if on the ANC form they write and they have hemoglobin below 10, but these people tell you actually they do not measure the hemoglobin. They don't do any lab tests for hemoglobin. That's an issue that has been existing, whether or not you build this into an electronic system, right? And this is something we can address to the higher levels of the child health department and say, what? In fact, that form which you take in health centers, they do actually, when they report that this number of mothers had hemoglobin below 10, they don't actually mean that. They just mean they just assessed and they were something else anemic. So we maintain it as it is, okay? And we know that it's, we take it as hemoglobin below 10, reported as hemoglobin below 10. And until such a time when the MCH department will maybe train them further or emphasize that the hemoglobin has to be measured because they are, let me put it that another way around. If you say we want to change this and call it observational disease, actually just observational anemia, won't be helping the clinical decision maker, I think. So,
And I wasn't really aiming to find out the answer to this at this moment, because I think it requires a bit more discussion. But I was looking to highlight the kinds of discrepancies, because I have a feeling that if you actually sat down and did this before, not just you guys, that I was trying to sort of raise awareness of the kinds of things that come up, so that people understand. There's a whole bunch more like this. Some are small, and some fit into big categories. So I was just kind of explaining the big categories. We doubt we'll resolve this, but again, as I mentioned, the process of how to resolve it is the important part. And we'll just have to pick one and go with that and decide how to, for the project, make sure we document it appropriately. And if we get it resolved later on, that's fine. Because right now, out there, because everybody uses the same forms. We're now going to have a slight modification on that because it's electronic, so we just need to make sure we understand where the discrepancies are and say, I know the things that they might agree on now, or get at least the engineers from, but if you think you're going to use this, make sure you understand this data, how it was modeled for the EMR. So that if you want to use that piece of data in a report, make sure you understand what the answer you're getting, what it means. And, I mean, there are a few of them, but most of them are small, and they fit into a couple of categories. Does anybody else have any comments? Advice? Strong feelings?
is there any decision you want us to take going forward as a group now?
I just want to reemphasize that this is not a REA issue. This is a country issue, right? This is coming to some sense of semantic interoperability without electronics. I mean, I don't think it really has anything to do with it. We're just happening to highlight it because we're forcing the issue, right? And so, to me, I think it's more about stewardship of content in the country. And I think having the terminology service is going to be a really fundamentally important way of getting people aligned. Because once you start getting a couple of things in, and you create the process to say, if you go create something, I want you to start using this lingua franca, then I think, we're in a much different position than we're at now. So I think right now we're dealing with just a early bumps in the road. I think you're just going to have to accept the fact that there's going to be a little bit of hard work involved in either transforming one source or another, or coming up with a transformation upon receipt, which is something that happens at. So we at the Health Information Exchange in Indianapolis are making these transformations all the time, right? And a lot of times we're stuck with what we get. So, I think there's the governance process you have to decide is whether you want each of these applications to speak the same language up front, or whether you want to take on the responsibility of dealing with it on the other end. And you're already starting to appreciate some of the challenges with doing it on the other end. But I think there's a reality that you'll only have so much human manpower to deal with it up front. And so you're going to run into the scaling issue as we have in Indianapolis. And so I think the wisdom of the HID model is that it doesn't necessarily force you into one decision or another. It gives you the opportunity to both pre-resolve or to post-resolve using the exchange as the arbiter, right? You can take any content that comes in and change it into something else. But, the work has to be done one way or the other. You either get people to agree upon the work up front and get it consistent on the forms, or you deal with it as we are right now later, right? There's no free lunch. So I guess all I'm really saying to you is you just got to decide, do you want to do that now, or do you want to do it later? And that's the only question that you can decide, right? So when the LIMS software comes in, okay, so let's just imagine how we have hemoglobins and tests that we're collecting manually on these paper forms, and you've got a LIMS software that comes in, and now all of a sudden it has different units, and that's what the system is producing, and that's what you get. What do you do with that? Do you change towards the LIMS concepts? Do you transform them as they're coming in? These are just issues you're going to deal with. This is Health Information Exchange, how it works. So I don't know if there's any real wisdom I can give other than it's going to have to be done. what I think we're asking is some guidance in terms of whether you want us to get the existing content on the same page up front, or do you want to do transformation on the exchange side to get it right later? Right?
And it's not an either-or. We can do both.
Yeah, and it's not an either-or. And actually, that example that you just gave in Quebec, they had bringing 110 different lab systems, 110 different labs with about 80 different lab systems. It was astounding.
Yeah.
And what they did was they said, all right, here's what we're going to have to do. First of all, we're going to have to start bringing this stuff in and doing something with it. So we'll start to do some translating. The other thing they did, though, was productize a plugin that could be used at the LIMS side, so that their end game was, no, at some future time, you're all going to be sending me stuff that is adherent to the way I want to get it. But between now and then, I'm not going to sit here with a bucket of fresh air. Between now and then, I will do my deal with the devil and try to figure out, what to make out of what you're sending me. But at some future time, you are going to send me what you're supposed to send. And they productized that enough that was a realistic expectation.
One pattern that Derek's comment prompts me to see, as we see the federal government of the United States prompting more electronic data exchange, some organizations like public health departments are struggling to go, okay, we're dealing with this mismatch problem. We don't quite know how to do it. We want to set some policies. We're not going to tell people that tomorrow you need to make this change, but we are setting regulations and expectations that in 5 years, 7 years, 3 years, here's the target. So we'll take what you got now, and we'll do the best we can with it, but in 3, 5, 7 years, this is what it has to be, so now you know. And so folks can start making that change over time. So just an interesting pattern you maybe want.
So do you want to get Rapid SMS, OpenMRS to say the same thing now? Or do you want the exchange to transform it when it comes in? That's the question for immediate question, right?
First attempt.
And what we were talking about the other day was coming up with the Rwandan code set. And I think we wanted to circle around to that. I think what we decided is we do want to send the same thing from each application, because we want to put in this concept of a Rwandan code set that is separate to all the other code systems that we have, but inclusive of all the concepts that we want to store. So I've been wanting to bring this up and say we should actually discuss how we should take the mappings that you've done and actually adding a column to them essentially, and putting in the Rwanda code sets.
So that's actually exactly what this was doing.
Just real quick highlight, just because you have a code set, the question still is, does that code set reside in OpenMRS, or does that code set get guaranteed to be translated to the HIE level?
Yeah.
That's the question.
They're all different questions. and so, first, can I just give my sort of observation from where I am right now? And that is that Rwanda has the opposite problem that you both described. You had existing lab and other systems that then had to combine data. Rwanda is now tightly controlling the front end, the data that it receives, until it has to also get stuff from National Lab and a few other sources that had already existed. We have an opportunity to try to harmonize it on front end. So I would see that Rwanda is going to approach this differently. And not that they don't have to transform it on the back, but we're going to do it right. It has to be done on one side or the other.
So the answer, what I hear you saying, we can answer the question by saying we can push this out to the edge systems because it's so well controlled.
Yes, that would be my suggestion. So that's pretty much the direction I'm going on that.
I know we said the other day as well.
And there's less damage.
Right.
So pushing it to the end system is not as burdensome as it would be in a situation where they have all this stuff in place.
And anyone to say so?
Just to be very briefly, I think it's important to relay the information straight out of Rapid SMS, to not assume that that implies that the people sending the SMS are being read in the code. Rapid SMS is just an application that is a user interface for a very low capacity set of users. So trying to say that some instances this number maps to this concept is solely the anti-pattern. Typically, you will want for complicated
the concepts are important, embarking more on a dialogue, maybe Q&A and verification, and do the work on the user interface side to make sure you're guiding the person into getting you the right concept, and then getting the right concept one time in the message.
Yeah, and that's another layer of complexity. So did you have a comment, Richard? I just wanted to quickly address Ryan's question about the concept, or did you want to?
I just want to make sure that Richard is understanding the fundamental question. Are you?
Yeah, I do get the question so very well. Just a very quick question.